Okay, we're live, and hello everyone. Welcome to a brand new platform. Same broadcast, same show, but new platform.
Same hosts.
It's the same host. Not much has changed, except for our technical incompetencies have been highlighted very quickly. And but I think we're good. I think
we're grand, Mary Ellen. Grand. A good word for today.
Absolutely. So yeah, Jared, how are you going? What's
doing well?
Yeah, that's
just good. Fun times in the office here, juggling the signs and the record and all the exciting things that we're doing, being online, and the magazines keep coming out and they're looking great. It's fun. I'm enjoying it.
Good. Magazines coming out is one constant in life. Death,
deadlines.
Taxes coming out. Deadlines. Yeah.
Deadlines are always happening, but that keeps us honest, I think, Mary Ellen.
Absolutely.
Keeps us
in check.
Busy and out of trouble.
Yeah. Well, today is a continuation of a topic that we've been talking about. Well, this is the second week. We're hoping to maybe do another week on top. And the topic is women in ministry. And last week we had Dr. Daniela Schubert from the South Pacific Division. She is the Women's Ministries and Women in Ministries Director, I believe. Both of them. That was
she correct. Does. Yep, Women's Ministry and Women in Ministry. I don't know if the title Director is attached to that portfolio anymore, but she does that for the discipleship ministry team at the SPD. Mm-hmm. And we thought this afternoon we'd talk to a woman in ministry, on the grassroots level, and hear some stories from her. And yeah, so I'm looking forward to our conversation today.
Me too. But before we jump into that, we'd just like to flag with everyone watching that our e-newsletter is the place to get all of the Record Live content, Record Wrap content, news stories of the week, features of the week, thoughts from Jared or myself or Juliana, our other assistant editor. It's full of really good stuff. And we just want to plug that because sometimes it's kind of hard to find these broadcasts once they've gone live. It's like, where do I find that? How do I navigate the Facebook page? If you subscribe to our e-news, you can just one click and it's right there. So we'll post that in the comments pretty soon. Yeah.
And the beauty, Mary Ellen, of our new platform that we're broadcasting on is not just the color and the logo that you see in the screen. It's also live to YouTube as well.
Right. Yes.
As Facebook. So there's more ways to encounter us. If you really like YouTube, that's your preferred platform. You can stay in that ecosystem and still watch our broadcasts and interact with us on that platform. So that's a part of the reason we're transitioning from Zoom, but I think it'll be exciting.
I'm excited. It's all streamlined. It all looks really fun on my screen, it's good. It feels good to have something new. Anyway, we digress. Today, everyone, get ready for an awesome conversation. We have the pleasure and the privilege of interviewing Jinha Kim, and I'll just bring her on the screen now. Jinha, thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Our pleasure, entirely. Jinha is a pastor at Melbourne City Adventist Church in Melbourne, and you're the mum of two boys?
Yes.
Yes, two boys. And you're married to your husband, who's also in ministry with you. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yes.
Correct. Roy is also a pastor.
Amazing. So a pastor couple. Wow, that must be a busy, hectic life that you guys lead. What does like an average day in your life as two pastors look like?
Well, it's changed over the years because every year we have different allocations. Probably the craziest was several years ago when I had a church, he had a different church, and then we had our church plant in the city. So for example, on a Sabbath morning or day, it was chaos because in the morning I would drive an hour away to go preach in one place. Roy would go to a different place to preach, and then we'd rush home, quickly feed the children. We're at the time one child, and then we would rush into the city and have our church service in the afternoon for the city, and eventually get home exhausted. So that was probably the craziest our lives were back when we had the 3 churches to juggle with our child. But nowadays it's a lot better because we've learned over the years that we can't have it all. So we've kind of cut down on our hours. And so one of us is part-time. And so my husband is very supportive of my call to ministry. So at times he's gone part-time, and then we'll swap, and then I'll go part-time, and then he will swap back. And now he's doing his master's as well. So he's part-time. Wow. And also he's the church planting coordinator for the conference, which means he doesn't have a Sabbath morning obligation. And then we still share our church in the city. So it's been a lot calmer Sabbath than in the past.
So much for a day of rest, hey? I think pastors probably work harder than any of us on Sabbath. It's crazy.
Yeah.
But it's also one of the kind of privileges of being joint, couple in ministries, that we get to have Monday as our day off, and the kids are in childcare and school, and then we actually have time together. And not everybody gets that, so we're blessed in that regard. That's
amazing. Wow, I really admire that ability to juggle and work as a team and compromise. Like, that is a marriage that I admire, definitely, a marriage dynamic. I'd be interested to know, Jinha, so you're a woman in ministry. Your husband obviously is a man in ministry. Have there been times, just on the topic at hand, that you've really had a radically different experience to him, like in ministry, being a woman, treated differently for your gender, or can you speak to that at all, just like as an overview?
Yeah, so I've kind of experienced what it's like to be a single woman in ministry, and then married in ministry, and then being a mom in ministry, and there's different challenges in each of those phases. For example, a lot of times when I go to ministers' meetings or ministers' retreats, I'm the only woman in the room. And that can be very isolating. And I know of other women, in ministry who have experienced that intense sense of loneliness when they're in these places, especially when the others have a very strong sense of camaraderie. You feel like an outsider. And so that can be a challenge that I think a lot of male colleagues don't experience in the same way. So that's one challenge. Another thing is that, I don't have a lot of female mentors and, women in ministry and senior leadership that I can see or, have in my life. And so most of my ministry experience, I've been very alone, not having an example or role model to look up to. And I have yet to attend a retirement celebration for a female pastor. And so I don't know what it looks like to end well, and to hear kind of like the whole ministry experience and the gamut of because you can be a pastor, you can be a professor, you can be very many things, but you're hearing that kind of gamut of experience at the end of their journey, I have yet to experience that. And so not having, I guess, and even if I know of some, they might be in another division or another state, and so I don't get to visualize what it looks like to lead, and to see that up front. So those are some of the challenges. There are more, but yeah.
That's very insightful. Very that's something that I wouldn't have picked up on necessarily. It's something that people don't see, because when you hear women in ministry, you might think, maybe sort of sexism or judgment based on gender, which is typically, I think, on a global scale what sort of happens. But in an Australian context, that's really fascinating to hear, that lack of mentorship, that lack of sort of, I guess, camaraderie, understanding in that sense.
Yeah, and I've ministered. I'm from the U.S. With my American accent. So I've done ministry in the U.S. as well as here in Australia. And it is true that here, for example, I'm in the Victorian Conference, and I love my conference, and they've been very welcoming and inclusive. And so a lot of people think that, we don't have that kind of sexism in Australia. But it was here in Melbourne a few years ago that I was preaching one Sabbath, and a man who was visiting, an Adventist member from an interstate, he came in. And I started preaching, and he stood up in the middle of my sermon and started yelling at me, saying that I should be ashamed of myself, that the Bible doesn't support women pastors. So he started yelling at me in the middle of my sermon. And my husband, who was in the back watching the kids at the time, had to escort him out. And that happened, 2018 in Melbourne, Australia. So even though we kind of think, Australia, we don't have that kind of problem. I mean, even in the politics that's going on, like it does still happen here.
How do you deal with something like that? Just at the front, how do you continue on? How do you process it later? Like, what's the?
Yeah. Well, I'm an emotional person. So when that happens, it definitely shocked me. And I actually became quite emotional, not only because of, the verbal attack against me, but I was actually really concerned for my children at the back, because they're listening to all this, they're hearing all this, they're seeing their mother being attacked, publicly. And then when my husband had to leave the kids to escort him out, I was, even more kind of concerned. And so then all those feelings of worry and anxiety about what was happening with him and with the kids, I did tear up. And what's beautiful is that in that moment, there was a person who was visiting our church for the very first time, a young lady who had grown up in the Adventist church, but had left as a young adult and had gone to, other churches, other denominations, and even kind of questioned her faith at one point. But she had visited our church for the first time that day. And she came up to me, in the pulpit, and she hugged me, and she whispered in my ear, and she said, "God has called you, so don't be afraid." And at the end of that, and then, I composed myself and I continued to preach. At the end of that service, that same young lady came up and said, "I want to get baptized."
Wow.
Yes. And so she got baptized in 2019. So, I guess and that's exactly the kind of thing that motivates us to keep going as women in ministry. Even when we face, prejudice or setbacks or difficulties, we love Jesus and we want to share Jesus. And so, when we're able to do God's will for our lives and answer his calling for us, even if people give us a hard time, we are able to persevere because of the joy of sharing Jesus with others.
Wow, that is such an incredible story. That gave me bumps just hearing that. I mean, awful to start with, but then very redemptive ending. Yeah.
I think another challenge that women in ministry face that men might not face is that, because we're so few and far in between, we do feel the privilege and the responsibility of representing women in ministry as a whole. Because if we fail, then we're making it difficult for other women in ministry to enter, because a lot of people will say it's not because it's Jinha, but it's because she's a woman in ministry. And so that is a weight that, again, it's a privilege to be able to have that responsibility, but it's also a weight that you carry. And so it does determine, sometimes I get speaking engagements and I can't do them all, right? So I have to say no, but sometimes, like this one, for example, I'm happy to do, because I recognize that, hey, if there's a way that I can contribute to more women going into ministry and them having space to do well, then I want to contribute to that.
What would you say, Jinha, to someone who's watching this, who might be a young woman who might have an interest or feel a sense of calling, but might feel maybe overwhelmed or have different voices in her church or in her ear that are sort of maybe discouraging in that space? It feels like we could do this later in the conversation, but it seems like a natural place to address that. What would you say to someone who might watch this down the track and be looking for some advice or some encouragement?
Well, first of all, that feeling is so normal. I think many of us feel that, we feel inadequate because we are, only God's grace can fill in that space. But, I had that same feeling of, for many years, because I didn't plan on going into ministry. And so as doors kept opening for me and I ended up going to seminary, and right before graduation, I was really scared about, okay, well, now after I loved being in seminary and learning, but now I have to enter the real world, right? And I prayed and I asked God, I was like, God, should I do this, or should I go down, the safe path of being a teacher, doing something else? And I prayed, God, you have to clearly open the door. And I prayed that, and then I went to chapel that day at the seminary, and the speaker happened to be Dr. Hybeth Williams. And she got up to preach, and she said, I prepared a sermon today but I felt impressed by the Holy Spirit to change it. And now I'm going to speak about women in ministry.
Oh,
And
wow.
she said, if there's any young women out there who are feeling scared, she said, I want you to know, when God opens the door, no man can shut it. And that was exactly what I had prayed for that morning. And so that was one of the many things that encouraged me, as well as people just, coming just when I needed that encouragement to say, I've really been blessed by your ministry. That affirmation has been very helpful as well. And so I just want to encourage any woman out there who's wondering, who feels the call but is scared. First of all, it's okay to be scared. And second of all, just know that when God empowers you and calls you, he's going to carry you through.
Wow. That is such an affirming and normalizing statement. And I think it's really great that you validated that emotion, because I think a lot of women experience that, not only in ministry, but in a lot of different professions.
Yes.
I would love, I would love to hear your story of how you actually pursued ministry as a path to start with, like given the lack of representation of women in the church. What inspired you to become a pastor?
Yeah. So like I said, I never actually pursued it. It pursued me.
Right.
I grew up in a Korean American context. And so in all of my churches, I didn't even see a female elder in my entire childhood. And so when, my parents taught us to love the Bible, and I did love giving Bible studies and teaching people about Jesus. And so I planned on actually studying theology to be a professor. I wanted to do my master and PhD in theology. And so in my undergraduate years, I had studied French, German, and religion, because it turns out those are prerequisites to doing a PhD in systematic theology. And so I had done that in my uni years, and was 2 months before graduation. And my uni was next to New York City. And 9/11 had happened my first year in uni. And by the time I was graduating, and I've got a whole story about that. But anyway, right before I was about to graduate, someone I knew who was an elder at a church in New York City in Manhattan said, hey, we're looking for someone to be an urban outreach coordinator, basically someone who would come in, give Bible studies, help our church reach the people in our community. And this funding had come about because of 9/11. And for some reason, I just really felt attracted to this, even though it didn't make any sense. Even though everybody else who was applying for this position were pastors, or at least had a undergraduate degree or seminary degree. I had a French and French literature degree, and so but I just felt so called to this. And I prayed and I said, God, I just feel like you're telling me to apply. I feel completely scared and inadequate, but if you want me to do this, then you have to help me go all the way. Don't get me halfway and then drop me, And so I ended up being one of the finalists to come and preach. I never preached before in that kind of setting, 250 people, church in Upper East Side of Manhattan, right across from Central Park. And I was so scared. And I remember going up and my knees were shaking. But as soon as I opened my mouth and I started to preach, and I remember I preached about the woman at the well and the encounter she had with Jesus, I felt incredible peace. And I really felt the whole, they have like stained glass windows, it's a huge church, but I just felt God fill that space. And when I finished preaching, the leadership team, they had tears in their eyes, and they came up and they said, I think we all felt the Holy Spirit here. He said, like never before. And they said, this is it. This is God's will for us. So they hired me, who was 21-year-old Korean American girl, to work in the city. And I ended up loving it. But once again, it was supposed to be like a 1-year thing, but they asked me to stay another year. So I was like, all right, 2 years, and then I'll go do my master's and PhD. But while I was there, they asked me, hey, do you want to go into ministry full time? Do you want to be a pastor? And I was really, again, scared about that idea, because I didn't even know that was possible. And so I really wrestled with it. I prayed about it. I studied the Bible. I studied Ellen White, to see, is there any reason why God wouldn't want a woman to be a pastor? And I came to the conclusion that God does not forbid women in ministry. So then I said, okay, God, once again, if you want me to do this, then you have to carry me all the way. So I prayed God to have them sponsor my studies at Andrews University. So I prayed this, and then a few weeks later, I got a call from the Greater New York Conference president, and he said, Jinha, we would like to sponsor you to go do your Master of Divinity and then come back to New York. And so then I got a free education, and there's a whole nother story of why I ended up in Melbourne instead of New York, but I don't know if you want to know that.
That was actually going to be my next question. Like, so you were in America, what brought you here?
Yeah. So this story involves Roy. So what happened was I was single this whole time. And then I went to seminary, was pastoring at a church there. I loved it. And I worked with various people, but one of the people I worked with was Roy Kim, who was also studying at Andrews. And while we were working together, the church that we had went from 40 to 120 in 3 years. And so we knew that we had a good thing going together. And, we were praying. Well, actually, sorry, backtrack. So we were just colleagues. There was no romantic interest at all. We were just working together. And what happened was the financial crisis of 2008 happened. And New York conference president called me and said, we've had to let go 18 pastors. And so we can't actually hire you back because we have no money left to budget for our pastors. Yeah, it was a horrible thing in the US. A lot of pastors lost jobs. And so they said, look, you can keep the money for the education, but we can't hire you back. So at the time I thought, okay, and this is one of the times where I thought, okay, God, do you want me to now do something else? And I was actually quite happy at the possibility of running away from this. Meanwhile, what I didn't know was that Roy was praying. And so I found this out later. Roy was praying, God, I would really like to have someone like Jinha in my life, but she's supposed to go back to New York. And Roy was supposed to come to Australia. And because he had Bible worked in Australia and he was supposed to come back to Australia to work. And so he prayed, God, if Jinha is the one for me, then please work it out that, she doesn't have to go back to New York. And I didn't know that he was praying this, but when I that week was telling everybody, hey, I'm not going back to New York, for him, he was like, this is it. She's the one.
Wow.
But of course, it took like several years for me to agree to that as well. And so, but by the time we, got into a relationship, and by the time we got married, what happened was there was actually a situation where he was supposed to come back to Australia and pastor a specific church. But when they found out that he was about to marry a female pastor, they actually didn't want him to come anymore. And so they canceled their call. Yeah. So at that point, we got married in April 15th, 2012. And we literally and I had already told my conference that I was quitting to go to, Australia. So neither of us had a future plan. And so we really made our marriage vows, for better or for worse, for richer or for poor, like thinking, where is God going to take us? And once again, we prayed, God, we really want to do urban ministry, because I had done that in New York City and he had done it in various places around the world. We really wanted to do a church plant because we felt that was something that we really loved doing. And we really wanted to work together. And so we said, God, please have one conference, hire both of us to do a church plant together full time. And everyone told us it's not going to happen. Everyone said, God can do a lot, but you're asking too much. And we said, okay, we'll see. And what happened was, there were conferences that wanted us to come, but, they wanted us to be at different churches or part-time, full-time, all that stuff. But then Victoria Conference called and said, we'll hire both of you to come plant a church for young professionals in Melbourne CBD together. And so we said, there you go. God answered our prayer. And people were shocked. We had theologians and professors at the seminary who were like, you're not going to get it. And when we told them, hey, we got it, they were like, wow, this is really a miracle from God. And so, yeah, we're very grateful for the Victorian Conference for believing in these two kids from America to come and to this church plant.
Wow, what a story.
Tell us a little bit about your church plant, or perhaps just the a little bit about the journey of it, but also just what church planting involves for those that may not have ever been part of a church plant. Why is church planting important? And a little bit of the journey of Melbourne City church plant.
Yep. So we came in 2012, and this church plant kind of didn't have a mother church. And so there was a small group of people. So really there were like 5 people. And so we came along and we said, okay, what we want to do is start a church in the Melbourne City that really can be attractive to people here who don't have a church background, or perhaps many people have left the Adventist church as children. So something that would be attractive to them, bringing them back. And so we really started from scratch. And so one of the key values of our church from the beginning has been providing a safe space where people can explore a Christ-centered worldview. And so one thing we realized is that a lot of churches assume knowledge, or assume that you know the Bible, or they even might use a lot of language, or the culture isn't very inclusive. And so we wanted to really create that safe space. And so one of the things that we normally do, not during COVID, but normally we have our sermon first, and then we have a discussion time where we have pre-written questions for people to discuss in smaller tables. And these questions are designed so that you don't have to have prior Bible knowledge, but it gives everyone a chance to explore these questions a bit deeper and the topic a bit deeper. And we try, and we're not the best at it, but we try to, when we preach, not assume prior knowledge, and to bring in topics that people can relate to. We've done series on, mental health, or we'll talk about things where we bring in, the ideas and the conclusions of secular experts, but how they actually align with biblical principles, and share what the Bible says, so that people can see that the Bible has validity and relevance in their lives. So we try to, do that. Our services are very simple. We don't have a lot of, bells and whistles. But we worship in a church. We worship in an office building, actually. And so it's not and there's a whole story about that as well. but yeah, that space was an answer to prayer. And so, God has just been amazing in leading our little group. So at the moment, we went from the 5 people to, at the moment, we have about 95. Not everybody comes every week, but and not everybody's Adventist. That's something that we really love, that every church on a given Sabbath, about 1/3 are Adventists, about 1/3 are Christians, and 1/3 are completely new to Christianity. Yeah,
that's great.
That's so incredible. It seems like throughout your story, the past 10 minutes that you've been telling us all these incredible things, you and your husband have been on the same page, and you've been working together, and you've just experienced all of these amazing miracles. I'd be interested to know sort of how that dynamic works between the two of you, and what sort of qualities as a woman you bring to that partnership, and what kind of qualities he brings to it, because I think women have a very different sort of skill set in a lot of ways. So just interested to hear thoughts.
Yeah, we do. And we also, I also want to be clear that it's not always easy, we have these answers to prayer stories, but we also have had seasons where both of us had incredible difficulties and had to work through a lot of personal as well as marital, and also for the church and as a family, because it's not easy doing a church plant. It's a lot of work. Because there aren't structures in place, and because there aren't a lot of volunteers in place, we do a lot of the work. And it's a lot like parenting. Our church plant was like a baby, and over the years, it's becoming more and more independent. But it's and we actually, 2 weeks after we arrived in Melbourne, I found out I was pregnant. So that was, we literally had a baby as well as a new church plant at the same time. So that wasn't easy. So definitely there are challenges to both of us being in ministry and having kids and juggling everything. I think what's really great about team ministry is that whenever there's diversity of any kind, you get different perspectives, and so the end result is that you have a more complex and more relatable end product, whether that's a church service, or whether that's how we think through the strategies and the vision and ministry of the church. We're able to bring different elements in because of my perspective and his perspective. And we do have different skill sets. And for us, it's very easy when we work together, so that I do all the Bible studies with the women, he does all the Bible studies with men. There are some crossovers as well. We do sometimes crossover, but generally speaking, because it's easier for the women to open up to me about what they're going through and vice versa. And so it makes sense for us to do it like that. And so for us, we're very lucky that we have that opportunity to minister in that capacity. I think also because we're different and we're able to, for example, we do a lot of weddings together where we both share the homily and we're addressing the bride and groom together. And so I think there's something beautiful about being created in God's image. You know, in the Bible, it says that God created men and women in his image. And so there is something beautiful about representing God more fully together to the church and to the community. We actually find that people in the community really love the fact that there is a female pastor and a male pastor, that they can see both aspects. And, you know, we have different preaching styles, and so our church get, you know, a more variety of you know, topics and styles and things. And so, yeah, I think the diversity, whether it's gender or background, experience, ethnicity, I think diversity is always a good thing.
What's the biggest sort of challenge that you find in maybe planting a church or even in ministry, just as a vocation, as a calling? What's the challenge that you find sort of?
I think one of the biggest challenges is that because ministry is a 24/7 thing, you can't clock out in the same way. And so I think the biggest challenge is creating good boundaries and being able to prioritize family and then prioritize church, and then being able to know how to balance that and when to sacrifice one or the other, and then having time for yourself and for each other. It is relentless sometimes. And I think it's hard to get that balance right. And I think a lot of pastors feel this way. And so you either work too much and you get burnt out, or, you know, you always feel guilty, or, you know, it's really hard to get that right. And you kind of, what we've learned over the years is that sometimes you just don't get it right, and you learn from it and you adjust. And so before the pandemic, we were probably doing too much, you know, and the pandemic kind of actually helped us realize, oh, this is what Sabbath feels like, to go for a bike ride with the kids in the afternoon and enjoy nature. We were like, oh, you know, so coming to this year, we've tried to make sure that we have some family time on the weekends, and not just the kids coming with us to visitations, you know, and really making sure that we carve out time for that and for each other. So, yeah, we're learning as we go.
Wow. As a mom, I'm really curious, because I know a lot of moms, when they do work full time, when they go back to work, although it seems like you worked, like you were pregnant while you were doing Melbourne City. It sounds like, is that right? You were pregnant at the same time?
Yes, I had 2 kids. So I've gone through 2 pregnancies and 2 births. And I did have some maternity leave, but in between. But because my husband is working for the church, I still preach during my maternity leave. Like, I still went to board meetings, you know, like I was still involved. But yeah, so it is a different experience.
Yeah. Have you ever felt, I don't know, guilty or as though you've wanted to take a step back from ministry, like permanently or you have gone part-time, you mentioned, because of the kids? Because I know a lot of women who are pastors, they have kids, and then, you know, what do you do with that? Because it is a relentless job.
Yeah, so mom guilt is real. And I think it's something that all moms I've talked with feel, regardless of their profession and regardless of if they're working or not. Because the reality is that as a parent, you're human, and you're dealing with human beings who have their human fallacies. And you're also learning how to parent this child. Every child is different as well. And so there's a lot of mistakes, a lot of failures, which result in a lot of guilt. And I've really struggled with this because as someone who, for most of my life, was able to do things relatively well, to finally get to a place where I was like, oh, I don't know what I'm doing, and I feel like I'm failing. And having to deal with all those emotions, you know, to be honest, has been very challenging. But what I've learned and experienced over the years is that that's where grace is so important as a Christian mom. Learning to pray and say, okay, God, I yelled at the kids today when I should have been patient. I'm really sorry. Forgive me. Help me to do better tomorrow. But also, Father, thank you for forgiveness and for the grace that's going to fill in the gap that where I left the huge gap, and I know grace is going to fill that gap. And being able to trust in God, I think that's something that my secular mom friends, they don't have that, and I think that guilt can really eat away at you. But for me, it's something that has been hard, but I'm learning to give it to God, and I'm learning to really trust in Him to lead me and our family, and take care of us. And something that also helps a lot with my mom guilt is looking at the Adventist pioneers and their stories. And one story that I'll quickly share is, Ellen White, she often traveled away from her children and left them with other people. And she also sometimes would preach with the children like near her. And one time she was preaching, and our grown son, William, fell asleep in the back. And she said to the congregation, "Oh, please don't judge my son for sleeping, because ever since he was a baby, I've been taking him with me to meetings, and he used to sleep in his basket on the platform next to the pulpit. So he's just used to sleeping while I preach, And I love that story, and I love reading about her and the other pioneers of Adventist history, women who had children but were preaching, were taking them along. I've definitely preached a sermon where Micah was playing with his car toys in the pulpit space next to my legs, and just reading about how they, from the very beginning knew how to answer God's call, but also, learned that you can't do it all, but, as you do God's will, He'll take care of it. And so, that's been really encouraging for me.
Incredible. Wow. Jared, it seems like I think we always do.
I was gonna ask a question. Sorry, Mary Ellen.
No, good.
But it's kind of changing a tangent. So if you've got something on this, feel free to jump in. But you mentioned you're from America, and in the news that we've been seeing and on social media, there's a lot of commentary at the moment with Asian Americans and some of the racism that they're facing because of the pandemic, because of comments from politicians and that sort of thing. And I guess possibly, I know that Australia is not immune to racism, and that we can have our own issues in this country. But with what's been going on, I guess, how have you been feeling? And also, where do you think the church's place is in commenting on some of these issues, or how can we help? Should we be doing more in a space? I know in a church plant in a city in Melbourne, there'd be a lot of people who are quite progressive in that city, and yet oftentimes the church says we shouldn't comment on political issues, or we shouldn't involve ourselves in some of these social movements that are happening. How do you navigate that as a pastor and leader in the church, but also as a person who might even be impacted, emotionally by seeing these things play out in the news and in the media? Like, I don't know if that's sort of out of left field. We didn't prep you for this beforehand, but can you share some ideas or some concepts with us that might help?
Well, I think I believe very strongly that we should have a voice and that we should care about what's happening around us. Last year when there was a lot of conflict happening in the U.S. with African Americans and how they were treated and the injustices that they faced, I preached a sermon about Brian Robertson, and he works tirelessly to help people on death row and other individuals who are unjustly treated. And there was a movie about him called Just Mercy. And so I talked about his story, but talked about the Christian perspective on that as well. And so I do think it's important for us to talk about these things. I think that when it comes specifically to the Asian American experience, that it is something that it's in the news, but it's not news for us because we've lived it. In the US as well as in Australia, I've faced racism. It's a different kind. The Australian racism is a bit more benign. For example, the number of times that people think that I work for an Asian church because I'm Asian, they assume automatically that I'm at an Asian church. And I was like, well, no, our church in the city is multi-ethnic. It's an Aussie church, but they just automatically assume that. And so I've had that kind of racism here. whereas in the US, I have faced a bit more kind of antagonistic racism. And so when those issues come up, if it's something that's very close to home, even when it comes to the International Women's Day and the march and the protests that happen, I do think it's important for us to show that we are on the side of equality and on the side of things that Jesus cared about. I think we do have to balance sharing our convictions, but in a way that always points to Jesus. And that's not always easy to do. Sometimes, if the conversation ends up being divisive, or it being about us, then that's not really helpful. But if we can lead the conversation towards Jesus and how he lived and what he taught, then I think that we should be a part of that.
Yeah, wow. It's a great answer. Yeah, very, very challenging and very, very relevant right now. I guess we're nearly out of time, but Jinha, I'd really love to hear your thoughts about, I guess, your vision for the church moving forward, either in what we just talked about, I guess the racism and equality space, but also like as a woman in your life moving forward, or just for your church plans. What are some of your dreams or your goals moving forward?
Yeah, well, I think specifically for our church plans, we're actually really hoping and dreaming and planning to now that we've become a bit bigger and more established, to impact the city in a significant way. We're hoping to have a center of influence in Melbourne City, so that we do have more of that permanent presence and that day-to-day contact. Because at the moment we're there Saturday morning, but to really be there in 24/7, well, in a way, Monday to Friday, and being open to the public, we would love that. And we're praying through that right now. But in general, my vision for like the Seventh-day Adventist Church as a whole, I think would be to be a bit braver. In Isaiah 43:19, God says, "Look, I'm doing something new. I'm building roads in the wilderness and rivers in the desert." And I think that if we embrace that, to be braver, are we open to investing in our future? Are we open to God doing new things? Are we making space for God to shake the world with his glory? I think that if we are just a bit braver about taking risks and being open and flexible and creative, and that's something that we're trying to do in our church locally. But I would love to see that as for the church as a whole, for the global church.
So simple yet so difficult at the same time. Being braver.
Be braver. It's a call that echoes through the Old Testament, isn't it? Be bold and courageous. That I remember that appeal to Joshua, and Moses says it to the people as well. And be bold and courageous. And I think it's valuable that we can all take away. Is there anything else that you'd like to add that you want to leave us with? Any thoughts or concepts that we haven't necessarily covered, or anything that you think that those watching can take? We like to end on a practical note here at Adventist Record. Can take into their lives, and to live well. Is there anything you can leave us with?
Yeah, one thing I've learned is to not be afraid to ask for help. And I think juggling, our kids, our families are all in the US. And so they've been amazing, and we've flown them out for long periods to help us. But there have been many times where they're not around. And we've had to say, you know what, call up our friend to ask him to babysit when we both have a meeting we both have to go to, or we're doing a wedding, and so can you help us watch the kids? And our community, our church friends have been incredible in stepping up. But I think a lot of times people are afraid to ask for help, or even with mental health, people are afraid to ask for help. But I would say, don't be afraid to ask for help, because chances are other people are going through the same thing, and it might actually provide bridges for you and others to share in that together. And so don't be afraid to be vulnerable and to share what's actually happening. I read a quote today that said, we don't inspire others by leading perfectly, but we inspire others by showing how we fail, but lead through that, And so I think it's being willing to be vulnerable.
I really like that quote that you shared.
I didn't quote it quite right, but something to
The paraphrase. I really appreciate the paraphrase that you shared.
Yes, as
great.
writers and communicators, we very much love quotes. So thank you for leaving us with that little word of wisdom.
Yeah, before we go, Jinha, I'm not sure if you've seen some of these comments coming through, but we've got a comment from New Caledonia. Thank you and God bless. Scott says, inspiring stories and encouragement. Looking forward to the book or books. So yeah, are there some opportunities to tell your stories in the printed word coming up? Are you thinking, planning, or are we planting a seed today that you guys might write a book about your ministry experiences?
Well, I would love to one day. It's actually one of my, bucket list things.
Yeah.
But I'm actually going to promote that Daniela Schubert and I'm part of the Women in Ministry Advisory, and we are actually working on a book sharing the stories of Adventist women in leadership. And so, yeah, it'll be great. I am one of those stories, but it'll be great to see other women and their stories.
Yeah.
Beautiful. Well, I'm sure Record will be able to plug that when it comes out. But yeah, we really appreciate the time that you've spent telling some of those stories to us today. And yeah, I've been certainly blessed by some of those stories, very inspiring and enjoyable to hear some of the experiences. And yeah, I hope that God blesses you and your ministry and your husband's ministry with your church plant there. I think we're all
so much.
hoping for the best there. So
thank you very much. I really appreciate you listening to all my stories.
Our pleasure. Oh, so good. Thanks, Jinha. And thank you everyone for watching, and we will see you next week. Bye.
Bye.